most of us have been brought up, I think, with the view of changing history or changing the world of the great leader concept. And it sort of goes like this. Every now and then, a genius is born who single-handedly changes the world. It could be Napoleon, it could be Mahatma Gandhi, it could be Nelson Mandela, it could be Florence Nightingale. It really doesn't matter, but it's all about that individual. Their skill, their determination, their ability to ride the cultural moment that brings about change. And I fear that we fed into that a little bit this afternoon by interviewing individuals, or today by interviewing individuals, because I think that view of changing the world is actually pretty depressing. I mean, what if you're not the next genius? You know, I'm not exactly sure when it finally clarified in my mind that I was not the next world-changing leader. But I am now very clear on that. Those that know me well are laughing that I would even think that in the first place. So what do I do? What do you do? I mean, you can pray for the next world-changing leader, but apart from that, I think it's all pretty depressing. I also think it's not how humanity works. We are relational beings. We do need each other. No one ever functions in solitary. Moreover, my observation is, and maybe your experience is, that the more gifted someone is in one area, the less God has given them in another. In other words, we all need each other if we are going to really contribute. I also think it doesn't reflect the historical record. When you look beyond the headlines, and it's convenient to write the biography or the article or tell the story of an individual, but when you look beneath the headlines, it's never an individual. It's always a group of people. And I've called this talk Small Groups That Change the World. I think that we should, rather than look for the next amazing leader, maybe be looking for small groups of people who care enough to combine their gifts to make a difference. One of the most famous examples, of course, was a group of men and women who worked for the renewal of culture in 18th century England. They were called the Saints. History renamed them as the Clapham Sect or the Clapham Group. And they not only worked to end the slave trade, but also started an extraordinary constellation of organizations and campaigns to care for those in need, to educate children, and to lift the moral tone of the nation. And they had enormous success. They affected, the biographers say, one biographer said that the ethos of the saints became the ethos of the age. They were also a catalyst, actually, to much broader change in the next century. But none of them did it by themselves. In fact, it was their relationships together that gave them their strength. One of the set that was led by William Wilberforce was the banker Henry Thornton. Henry Thornton bought Battersea Rise. He then decided that if he was going to create a community there, that this house was not big enough. And so he added an east wing and a west wing so that they had 34 bedrooms. Because he also had 2 acres, he put 2 other family-sized houses in the grounds. And in a pre-Victorian age, which was one of great formality, people often spoke of the informality of their relationships, as if they were a family. Here's what one biographer said. These were the people for whom family and friendship were of the utmost importance. They lived in each other's spare rooms. They married each other's brothers and sisters. They prayed together, worked together, dreamed and schemed together, consoled each other, and criticized each other's work with ruthless honesty. I want to suggest we need more small groups that change the world at this point in time. Groups of people who care about a common cause, become friends, and start to dream about where they could make a difference. They may have a particular industry in mind, or a particular local community, or maybe even a company. But they want to be inspired by their faith to work for the good of all. And the Clapham group are not the only example. Let me give you another example. This was a group of some of the most famous academics and authors of their time. And they crafted the most remarkable stories that people are still telling today. In fact, I vividly remember my father reading one of those stories to my sister at bedtime and struggling to hold back the tears because of the power and pathos of the writing. Their stories were full of values that they thought were in danger of disappearing at a time of great cultural change. And one author had particular skill of weaving in the story of the gospel to books that it was said were written for children and read by adults. And these writings have stood the test of time. They've been in constant print for the last 70 years and have sold millions of copies. Along the way, they've become popular plays and even blockbuster movies. I'm talking, of course, of the group around C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien, authors of The Lion and the Witch and Wardrobe, and then of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, respectively. And they called their group not the Saints, but the Inklings. They would meet twice a week in either the college rooms of Merton College, Oxford, or a local public house. They weren't all authors. There were lawyers, clergymen, medical doctors, and soldiers amongst the crowd. But imagine the scene. If at Merton College cups of tea would be passed round, pipes would be lit, something a little stronger if they were in the pub, and somebody would begin to read a novel, a clever piece of apologetics, a piece of poetry. Then comments and criticisms would flow, and they would debate often until the early hours of the morning. It's impossible, I think, to exaggerate the strengthening force that that group had on one another. Thinking, I suspect, of that group, C.S. Lewis said, "Is any pleasure on earth as great as a circle of friends by a good fire?" I wonder what could get done today if God were to draw together a new generation of Inklings. And just in case you think that the Clapham group and the Inklings are the only examples, let's just do one more. The third group were lesser known, but they fell in love with India. And they gave their lives for working for the cultural, social, and spiritual renewal of that amazing nation. They were led by a cobbler from Northamptonshire, whose name was William Carey. They were not afraid of creating enemies where necessary. They clashed with the East India Company, who said India is all to be exploited for trade. They said you don't treat any nation like that, and business is never for that purpose alone. They clashed with the military people, like the Duke of Wellington, who said India is to be invaded. They clashed with the intellectuals who romanticized the culture and wanted to elevate every element of it. And they said no culture is of the sort of quality where everything is good and nothing is to be criticized. They gave themselves to improving the nation, and they were known as the Serampore Trio, Serampore just north of Calcutta. For thousands of years, the Indian elites had educated their children and governed the nation in Persian. This, of course, meant it was inaccessible to the popular man, the common man, and ensured there was no accountability for the elites and no social mobility. If you can't speak the language, you can't get the top jobs. So William Carey worked on firstly improving and developing the language, Bengali. Interesting now, it is the only Eastern language that has won the Nobel Peace Prize. He worked on improving it and empowering working people by making them proficient in it. He gave himself to publishing Indian classics into English and the Bible and other texts into Bengali. In fact, he also translated the Bible into 6 other languages and parts of the Bible into another 20-something languages. To say he was prolific is an understatement. As well, he and his friends campaigned against the cultural practice of Hindu wives being burnt along with their husbands on their husband's funeral pyre, throwing themselves on alive. He said no nation should treat their women like that. He introduced the first steam engine. He lectured in botany and zoology. He trained the civil service in ethics, introduced the first Indian-speaking newspaper, and led hundreds of people to Christ. Now, to accomplish all of this, or even a little of this, cannot be done by one man. Carey was an expert at translation, but unless he'd had another expert at printing, that translation would never have got out. The Serampore trio included Hannah Marshman. She was the businesswoman who funded the whole enterprise. Her husband Joshua, a preacher and translator, and William Ward, formerly a newspaper editor, who built and ran one of the early printing presses and was able to use the different fonts and whatever else was necessary for the different languages they used. I wonder whether God might be forming some other groups in a similar spirit in our day and in our age. Let me just finish with a few reflections on some common traits of these groups that might apply to other groups that start to develop amongst us. Firstly, they mixed a common passion with a diverse set of gifts. They knew what they were for, but they were different. Wilberforce needed authors like the prolific Hannah More, who shaped the nation through her novels. C.S. Lewis needed those who would create a positive environment which would foster fertile creativity. As I've said, Carey was an expert in translation, but it would have never gone anywhere had he not had a newspaper editor who knew how to get the whole thing printed. Secondly, they shaped their lives in such a way to see a lot of one another. The Clapham group moved to Clapham. Many of them. Some of them visited regularly from Cambridge and Brighton and other places. The Serampore trio lived under the same roof. But, and here's a slight warning, reserve some of every Saturday evening for the sorting out of conflicts. For those of us who would idolize such ways of living, the Inklings would even holiday together on walking trips across the English countryside. Thirdly, they had great convictions and they had great confidence. William Carey's famous motto was expect great things from God and attempt great things for God. Love that to be a banner across us today. Expect great things from God and attempt great things for God. And the reality was that each of these small groups took this to heart. When C.S. Lewis was invited to address the nation in the wartime on radio, he did so in 2 lectures, which became the basis of the book that many of us will have read, Mere Christianity, which is probably the most powerful apologetic for the Christian faith that was written in the 20th century. He became a household voice, recognized right across the nation because of his expecting great things from God and attempting great things for God. Fourthly, they nurtured their spiritual lives. When you're like Jed and you're engaged in AI, or when you're like Rachel and focused on exploited women, or Dirk and busy thinking, how can I influence in ethical ways? It's easy to lose the importance of our spiritual lives. There were several pastors involved in the Clapham group. And Wilberforce and his friend Henry Thornton would often go to hear one of them preach in the morning at Hyde Park Corner and then walk 4 miles to Monument, no district and circle line in those days, in order to hear them preach again in the afternoon. And despite a life of ceaseless activity, Wilberforce wrote this. He said, "My only solid hope for the well-being of my country depends on the persuasion that she still contains many who love and obey the gospel of Christ, that their intercessions may yet prevail, and that heaven may still look upon us with an eye of favour." Despite his great contacts, the fact that the Prime Minister was his closest friend, and his great abilities, he said, "I trust in God." And finally, they kept going. Each of the groups had a sense of commission, a goal they wanted to reach, and they didn't stop until they got there. It took Tolkien 17 years to write The Lord of the Rings. It may have taken some of us 17 years to read The Lord of the Rings, but it took C.S. Lewis 37 years to write and publish the canon of material that he produced for us. Carey lived in the Calcutta area for 41 years and died there. Wilberforce pursued the abolition of the slave trade for 46 years. In fact, even then he didn't stop. On the night the Emancipation of Slavery Bill passed, Wilberforce turned to Thornton and said, "Well, Henry, what should we abolish next?" A great example of the sort of stimulus small groups can be. I wonder what small groups are meant to come together in our age. They will almost certainly focus on a particular sector of society. It could be the media or the arts. It could be education or science and technology. It could be across an industry or within a single company even. I was thrilled to hear about Dirk's public faith, 70 professionals in the influencing industry that would come together. We should pray for him as we pray for the creation of many other similar vehicles. These don't necessarily need to be for people in senior roles. They could be for people just starting out in mid-career, senior figures, or just a mix of all three. But their joint commitment is to love one another as they join God in the renewal of all things. Small groups that change the world.